And we are going to, because we do have more time and fewer speakers than this morning, we're going to have the advantage of actually trying to not put you to sleep. I know you just had lunch. I judge success when I give a talk by how many people don't go to sleep. So please, try to stick with us. But what we're going to do is go over some issues that relate to the longer term agenda. This morning we heard a lot about a relatively short-term challenge, absolutely critical, the global economy, obviously. But in relation to what we're going to talk about this afternoon, that's really fairly short-term. We want to focus on the long term, and long term that has significant impacts on the global economy. Now, I'm going to probably mix up the terminology for sustainable development, green growth, green economy, environmental sustainability. I apologize in advance for doing that, but quite frankly, I haven't quite gotten a grasp of the distinction among these. I know there is some. My colleagues tell me there is some. Maybe I've been around too long, but so I apologize in advance for mixing them up. But at the end of the day, what I want to make sure that we understand right off the bat is when I'm talking about any of these issues, I'm not talking about a Western notion of having a nice, clean environment so we can go out and enjoy a nice walk through the woods. That's not what this is about. What we're talking about here is people. We're talking about people getting out of poverty. We're talking about people having the ability to enjoy equitable growth, economic growth, and social growth. We're talking about the triple bottom line of economy, of social systems, and environment. When we talk about governance, the subject of the program here today, tomorrow, on the issue of sustainable development on green growth, it really is, at the end of the day, what we do as an international community and the global governance we adopt is going to determine how much we improve the welfare of these folks. This happens to be a group of students at a vocational school in Morocco. I picked this picture so I wouldn't have any pictures from any country that's represented here, so I don't get in trouble that way. I'm going to talk quite a bit about, or I'm going to try and focus this talk about the changes from the first Rio summit to today. So 1992 to today. As many of you know, there will be a big show in Rio in June this year, Rio Plus 20. And so much of our reflection today in the World Bank, at least, and among my community of practitioners, is really what's happened in the last 20 years, what have we learned, where did we blow it, what do we need to do to improve the future. And indeed, if you look at the economic performance of the world, in spite of the less than optimistic discussion maybe this morning on what might be coming our way in the very near term, real economic growth has greatly outpaced the population growth, and we've seen a real increase in global prosperity. We've had historic poverty reduction over the last 20 years, and a great increase in literacy and life expectancy. In fact, the MDGs largely are on track to be achieved. Not all of them, but largely on track to be achieved. The poverty rate has dropped from about 42% in 1990 of people living in extreme poverty to what's expected to be about 15% in 2015, in just 3 years. Together with that improvement has been, as I mentioned, tremendous improvements in literacy and in life expectancy and so on. So there have been real measurable levels of progress globally over the last several years. However, and so because of that, we can really, it's easy to step back and say, talk about the blue skies. We've made great progress, hoorah. Unfortunately, that doesn't really count for near enough to be too optimistic looking forward. First off, we still have huge challenges. There are almost 1.5 billion people that are without electricity, without modern energy, 2.6 or so billion people that have no access to sanitation, 880 million people that don't have clean drinking water, 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night, et cetera, et cetera. So there are still major challenges. On the environment front, these challenges are interrelated with overcoming the challenge of dealing with the current poverty rates, the future poverty rates. We cannot further improve the global economy in a sustainable fashion if we don't address some of the real challenges. So I'd like to take a look at this chart. I think this is very handy for looking at the challenges we have. What this is the inner green circle is essentially a safety zone for the points at which within there's adequate resilience of the Earth's ecosystem to overcome the kinds of changes that are taking place. But the wedges here are the status of different challenges that we're looking at. So biodiversity loss, the nitrogen cycle, that the issue that's causing dead zones in much of coastal areas, the Gulf of Mexico and elsewhere in the world, and on climate change. These are already well exceeding, they're well outside the safety zone. But we also are getting close on acidification of the oceans, on the phosphorus cycle, again a nutrient issue, on freshwater use, on water, and this will change very rapidly as climate change increases. And then change in land use. So we're in pretty bad shape on most of the major issues. Ozone, we thought we were doing better than we are, but there's some new data coming out that is frightening on depletion of the ozone layer. But this is one of the success stories in our world. So this is today. Where are we going to be in 10 years, 15, 20 years? And that's what we really have to focus on. A recent McKinsey study tells us that in the year 2030, we're going to have 3 billion additional middle-class consumers in the world. 3 billion, in addition to what we've got today, consumers. The reason that we've got these problems is because of unsustainable consumption, driving or being supported by unsustainable production, use of natural resources, and so on. So the real challenge we've got is not just dealing with these issues that we've got today, but actually what are we going to do about these issues over the coming 20 years as the population increases, as the middle class and the consumption demand of the middle class increases. And I'm going to talk a little bit in the next few minutes about some of the challenges that we have to address to actually get anywhere close to checking this and these other issues and keeping these, particularly these three and this challenge from getting outside the green area. Climate change is obviously a major issue. Climate change is interrelated to all of the environmental issues. It's caused by, again, irresponsible production and consumption. 2010 was the warmest year on record. In much of the world, including some of the areas of the world that are the most sensitive to change in terms of violent disruption, least resilient to change, the poorest countries, places like Yemen and Somalia, are experiencing severe droughts. They're experiencing greater frequency of droughts and floods in many of the least resilient countries over the world, the poorest countries. So we're already seeing the effects of these changes on a number of the world's economies. So climate change is the first big challenge, in my view. It is this is a shot of, it's not just about the poor world, right? This is a shot of Abu Dhabi. This is some simulation that their environment agency did, that this is what it'll look like with a 1 meter sea level rise in Abu Dhabi. And if you've been to Abu Dhabi, you know that those are pretty fancy pieces of property, and all these blue areas, the light blue areas, are currently developed areas which will be underwater. So it's not just about the poor countries. What my institution focuses on are obviously the poor countries. In the higher countries, it's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is about learning to adapt, but those economies are much more resilient to the kinds of change that climate change will bring. In the poor countries, it's not about greater efficiency in energy or consumption to a large extent. It's about becoming more resilient. It's about economic growth. It's about being able to actually absorb the shocks that they're going to feel that they didn't cause due to climate change. So in the low-income countries, the poorest countries, the most vulnerable countries, our focus is on how do we increase their resilience to these climate shocks that are already taking place. Now, the Rio summit did achieve a lot. The issues that I just described and the ones that I'll talk about in a moment were largely known or not well understood, but they were predicted as significant challenges in '92 at the Rio summit, at the Earth Summit. As a result, we got the Climate Convention, we got the Convention for Biological Diversity, we got principles for forest management. The GEF, the Global Environment Facility, was agreed upon in principle, and Agenda 21 was adopted. And Agenda 21 is very important because it said that these are global issues. This is a global gig. The Rio gig was a global gig, but the solution is local, and the solution is national, and the solution is not government. It's government, civil society, private sector, think tanks, and so on. And that's what Agenda 1 basically is. Agenda 21 is as valid today as it was then. It's as weakly implemented today as it started out, unfortunately. So where are we going with 2012, 20 years after Rio? And I think that this is an interesting challenge, and I'm not giving you any indication that all of you ought to be buying tickets to Rio. I don't know what's going to come out in Rio, and I'll, at the end of this little talk, I'll discuss a little bit my views on the global governance issues and the role of governments. And Rio is very much a government, UN organized event. But I think it's important to pay attention to this because this is the greatest emphasis on where we go over the next 10 to 20 years in terms of dialogue among stakeholders that we will have for some time. Agenda 21 needs to shift to focus on economic incentives, disincentives, systems that enable those economic incentives to take place. So in this morning's panel, the issue of being able to actually enforce agreements is one of the big issues that needs to be discussed. In addition to the broad discussion on sustainable development, we will see much more discussion on green inclusive growth. And this has become a political football, and we can talk about that a little bit later. MDGs need to shift, in my view, to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. They need to be monitorable with real targets that can be achieved. The MDGs showed us that that is doable. But in my area of work, in environmental sustainability, we've done an extremely poor job of being able to identify indicators, let alone monitor and report on how well we're doing on those. So that's a big challenge. Rio was about what governments can do for sustainable development. Rio Plus 20 has to be more inclusive. And I would emphasize in particular the private sector. And we've, quite frankly, experience on the climate change agenda and the discussions on climate change do not leave me very optimistic that there will be the level of engagement of the private sector by governments in particular that will achieve what needs to be achieved. I think the private sector is ready to come to the table. I don't think governments understand how to get them there. It's not about ministries of environment. It's about ministries of finance, planning, economy, sector ministries, agriculture, tourism, energy, et cetera. And I think we're seeing much greater involvement of them. So that's a good news story. In Rio, women on the agenda was an afterthought. Today we know that if we're talking about sustainability, we've got to build gender into it. My personal experience is that we're still pretty good at talking about this. We've got a long ways to go to figure out how to really make it happen. And let's see what happens in Rio on that agenda. In Rio, it was all about come up with additional money. We need a lot of money through ODA to help us make this happen. Well, there's never been enough money in ODA to make what ODA is supposed to do happen. There's not going to be enough money in ODA to achieve what needs to happen in climate change and biodiversity conservation and so on. So really in Rio Plus 20, it's about innovative financing. We've got to come up with new ways of making sure that money is available where it's needed and is used efficiently and effectively. And then again in Rio, it was very much about the north-south. And there was a little bit of discussion this morning on technology transfer. I would say that technology transfer, knowledge transfer across the board is going to become more and more south-south, south-north, in addition to north-south. And again, I think we're learning on that, but we've got a ways to go to really capitalize on it. Rio talked a lot about technology, and technology is very important. I think in many areas, energy in particular is a good example of where technology has made tremendous strides. But technology is not the solution if you don't have the right policies and policy reforms. We can have great technology for renewables, but we still have $300 billion a year in subsidies for fossil fuels. Well, if you don't deal with that, then you're probably not going to get the right incentives to get the technologies in place that are coming to the table now for use. And so if we want to accelerate and if we want to go to scale, we've got to deal with the policy issues. And again, that will come back to discussions on governance. We also have to start measuring what we are doing, what we're losing, what we're using. Environmental degradation causes real impacts, real costs to the economy and to the welfare of people. But these costs go unmeasured. So one of the things that we've started in the World Bank with a number of partners is WAVES, Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. The reality is, and there was some discussion this morning on GDP, I really appreciated the comments on how poorly GDP gives a true indication of certainly the wealth. Maybe that's not what it's for, but we know it has serious limitation when it comes to measuring natural capital as a part of a nation's wealth. And certainly because it doesn't measure the use of that capital, it can send very wrong signals using conventional GDP when you're talking about growth and development. So one of the things, and this is quite frustrating for me because this is an issue we talked about in 1992. We've made very, very little progress on really trying to build an assessment of the values of ecosystems and ecosystem services and other natural resources that are easier to measure the values into national accounts. And so we have this WAVES program, the Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. It was a partnership to try and demonstrate in interested countries how you can really take this measurement of these values, plug it into accounts and use it for policy setting, for assessing how well your economy is doing over the long run, as opposed to an interesting little discussion among environmental economists. Again, this has been frustrating, but I think we're making some headway now. Partly it's because of new information. It's easier to get information on the status of the natural resource base. In '92, we didn't have all the GIS, the kind of geospatial information systems. We couldn't monitor the forests and the deforestation rates the way we do today. So there's a lot of progress in the ability to measure these. We're now learning how to actually value the delivery of ecosystem services. What's the water worth that a protected forest generates for downstream agriculture, industry, and urban uses? Put a value on protecting that forest so that you have that water downstream. We're getting much better at that, but the ability to actually do a comprehensive assessment, put it together as a part of a national account, only exists in a couple of places, and even there it's usually linked to, for example, Botswana's done a very good job on understanding the value of its ecosystems and ecosystem services for tourism. And that's a very important element of their economy, so it makes sense. But it misses out on all the other elements of the use of those natural resources. Let's see. Let's skip that one. Another area that I think we could make very quick progress is in the urban sector. A lot of our challenge today is really going to scale with change and with transformation, seeing transformation. And in the urban sector, because urbanization is going to be so rapid in Asia, in much of Africa, with adequate policy reform, with adequate finance, with adequate technology transfer, and capacity of institutions, I think that this is an area where we have great potential to see low carbon, climate resilient urban growth that generates great economic benefits for local and national economies. So I think this is an area that particularly on the green growth agenda, we have tremendous potential. It's politically extremely difficult. I worked in the urban sector for many, many years, in urban environment sector for many years in India. And we had all the right things happening until it came time for an election. And then things like water pricing, electricity pricing, and so on became part of the political football, and it's a lot easier to tell the urban poor, particularly those who live in slums, that, well, they want to charge you for your water, but we're not going to charge for water. Well, never mind, those people didn't have access to water anyway. They were paying more than anybody else for water, but it's a really good political thing to say. And so it's an extremely difficult sector to see major policy reform and transformations, but it does present great opportunities for us. And then finally, in terms of sectors, I want to mention agriculture. I think we've been way behind on understanding, particularly, you can call it climate smart agriculture. That's a term we use in the World Bank. There's so much room to not only reduce emissions from agriculture, and that's the interest of many of the industrialized countries, the developed countries, but if we transform agriculture to be more sustainable, we end up using less water, fewer chemicals, you have better yields, and eventually you have more sustainable yields because of better care of the natural resource base. That's not what's happening today. And so agriculture presents a great opportunity for not only reducing emissions of GHGs, but also increasing resilience of economies and addressing the needs of the rural poor. So that's an area where there's tremendous potential. A lot of the early discussions on green growth didn't even talk about agriculture. It was mainly an urban infrastructure focus. Then finally, let me just mention a couple of things on governance. And I was trying to figure out what picture to put up. But I decided to put a picture of a very typical decision-making body that determines global governance. I'll skip the economic part. And I'm pretty disappointed in that process. And since Rio, we've had 20 years of negotiations on climate change. If I hire someone to negotiate something for me and they haven't successfully negotiated in a couple of years, I'm going to fire them. But we got the same people mostly sitting around the table negotiating the climate agenda that we had 20 years ago. There's not a whole lot of progress being made in this process. And why? Because it's not engaging effectively the key stakeholders. It's not engaging the private sector effectively. It's improved on civil society, but it's still not there. It's still very much a government-driven, and often a government-driven outside of the sectors that count in those governments. So what you ended up with, and this is true on most of the environmental conventions that came out of Rio, you end up with a government body that specializes in that convention. They're not linked to transport, economic ministries, to energy ministries, to the other line ministries in governments. And so they get involved in the negotiations and they have a world of their own. And that's what we've seen in a number of these negotiations. The climate negotiation has improved recently. Ministries of finance, because there's enough money coming on the table, in my view, ministries of finance are paying attention from both developed and developing countries, those who are going to fork over the money and those who expect to receive it. But that's only happened in the last 3 years. So there's a real need to think very seriously about how we develop global governance. And if you read the Rio +20 documents, which I would encourage you to do, I'm not very optimistic because I see more of the same. I don't see, they talk about changes in global governance, but I don't see that it's going to generate much change in how things happen on the ground. So what does that mean? It means we've got to go outside of that system. It means that we've got to focus very much on local capacity, on national capacity, and I'm focused mainly on developing countries because that's where I work, but enabling them to look at their own situation, look at home. What are these impacts of environmental those activities that are affecting environmental sustainability, locally, nationally, and globally? How do those impact them, and what can they do to take care of themselves? It's very much self-interest driven. If they do that, then they'll come to the table with solutions that I think they'll find a lot of commonality for and eliminate some of the politics that were introduced in the early 90s in these discussions. For that, we need much better institutions in many countries, which means capacity development, particularly in the poorest countries. We need much better information, and I want to mention that I noticed that one of the colleagues here is from CSIRO. They've done a remarkable job of starting to develop a database that looks at the intensity of use of resources and materials in development, in consumption. It's one of the best things I've seen in 20 years. It's hardly been noticed outside of a community of practitioners that's interested in that. But it has tremendous potential, along with issues like wealth accounting, to really change the way governments look at how they use their resources and generate growth. I think there's going to have to be, in terms of governance, a lot more like-minded countries coming together and agreeing that, we will participate in the global agenda, but we need to make some headway on a particular issue that we have a common interest. And I think we've got to see a lot more of that. Finally, I think that we've got to see a better balance in the short versus the long term. I consider the discussion this morning to be very critical, and many of you are very focused on that. But to me, that's a short-term issue. I mean, in 2008, when the financial crisis hit, $1 trillion came to the table in nothing flat. Nothing flat. But if you talk about trying to come up with $1 billion or $2 billion or $5 billion for climate change, an issue that's going to have a tremendous impact in 2050, it's very difficult to get any interest. And the first thing that I hear is, with today's global economy, how can you expect any money to be put on the table? Well, guess what? 5 years from now, it's going to cost a whole lot more to address these issues. So I think we've got to get a better balance of the short term and the long term. And I don't see that happening yet. And I think that is the real challenge. I think that G20 is well positioned to take that challenge on, and I hope that as they have attempted to do in some years in the past, I hope to see that come in. And it's only by that measure that we'll see real movement on the climate change agenda, on ecosystems and the health of ecosystems, on the health of water and the access to water, and the oceans agenda. So with that, I want to close and invite my colleague and friend Tay to give his presentation, and then we will have Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you.